Well, hello, and welcome to this panel. I'm Mark Hall, a professor of law and public health at Wake Forest University, and I'll be moderating. And I want to begin by introducing our three panelists, each of whom has unique perspectives on these issues, and we'll be eager to hear their initial thoughts. We'll begin with some overview remarks that each has prepared, and then we'll have a back and forth and a conversation about our topics. So we'll begin with Russ Jacobs, who is General Counsel at the Association for Court-Appointed Advocates and Guardian Ad Litem for Children, based in Seattle. He teaches as an adjunct at University of Washington, and has a variety of interesting perspectives to bring to bear about privacy-related issues. We'll next hear from my friend and colleague Shannon Gilreath, who's a professor at Wake Forest University, expert in various aspects of constitutional law, and also brings to light issues about the academic setting and how we try to engage during these strange times in ways that meet our objectives, but also honor sort of individual rights. And then Chad Marzan is a professor at Florida State University in the College of Business, and he is a national expert in all things disaster related, particularly from the insurance point of view, starting with crop disasters, but he's written important works on how public and private sectors intersect in helping and trying to cope with disasters. So I want to thank the Law Journal students for bringing together such an interesting combination of perspectives for this sort of broad sweep, but I think there's a common element here that we want to address from our multiple perspectives, which is we've all been through unprecedented times. And had just a whole array of different experiences, not just individually, but socially in the policy sphere. And we would sort of cathartically relate what we've experienced, but also reflect on what we can learn from those experiences for future disasters. So, because anybody can tell you there's going to be more. They could be public health, they could be environmental, they could be natural, they can be economic, they can be lots of different things. And so when, pressed with unprecedented challenges, we respond in ways that are sort of survival or whatever it is that flight or fight at an individual as well as the social level. And some of those are more effective and adaptive than others. And I think this is a great opportunity to, we're sort of, light at the end of the tunnel. We see the possibility of emerging from this phase, and it's a great time to, while things are fresh on our mind, reflect what have we been through. There's the trauma of it, but also kind of the I hate to be so trite as lessons learned, but really sort of fundamental insights that we can gain for future scenarios. So with that broad sort of thematic introduction, let me start with Russ Jacobs and say, what perspectives and thoughts do you have to bring to bear on what we've been through and what we can learn?
Well, thank you, Professor Hall, and thank you also to the Journal. And you bring up a lot of good points about us being intentional now about thinking about what we've all gone through. And we can draw some lessons, I think, from disasters that have happened in the past, both public health, as you alluded to, but also from 9/11 and the terrorist attacks in 2001, and how we responded as a nation then, and what we can learn from that, and how we need to be intentional about thinking about what we've gone through. And I'll talk generally about privacy and how privacy has been impacted during COVID-19 and why it's important to take an intentional look at it. I won't go into a lot of detail about what privacy is, but I think it is important just to provide a little bit of an overview. When I say privacy, what do I mean? Because privacy can mean a lot of different things to different people. And so just generally, when I think of privacy, it's about acknowledging and respecting a zone of personal sovereignty. And that generally comes up in three spheres or zones. So the body, the home, and in information. And those, the legal regimes with respect to privacy for each of those zones draw from very different sources and are regulated in very different ways. So people will use that word privacy, oftentimes talking about a very specific application when that doesn't translate necessarily across those different spheres or in those different segments. Because when you're talking about privacy from a criminal law perspective, then you're really thinking about government actors and your home and your body, which is different from thinking about privacy with respect to your employer. But there are some themes that you can look at across all of those different spheres and how the norms have changed. And generally, when we're thinking about the law with respect to privacy, it comes from common law torts, and then there's federal statutes that are for specific industries, and then also you have state statutes. But it's not, in the US, we don't have one privacy law that applies to all of this. So I just wanted to set that groundwork for those who are listening who are trying to get oriented when I talk about privacy, that we can't talk about just fixing a privacy law or amending a privacy law. Privacy law is very disaggregated and comes from multiple sectors. It's also important to note that a lot of the norms relating to privacy aren't from statutes or from the common law, but they come from contracts. So a lot of the privacy policies, yes, they will draw from statutes, but privacy policies on a website, on an app, that's really an arrangement between the company that's behind that website and the user on it too. So when we think about how privacy has changed in all of these different spheres and in all of the different ways that those are regulated, it can be, that's pretty vast, right, in terms of thinking about that. But I just wanted to point out a couple of things in these opening remarks, which is that our conception of home has changed. So prior to lockdowns and shutdowns, your home was a space that you were in with your friends and family, and that you could invite people into or exclude them from. But as school and as work moved into a virtual environment, then you're allowing a lot more people into your home by necessity with the changes that have happened within society. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, because that is what has been necessary in order for these interactions to continue, but it reconceptualizes the home. So it moved from being a principally private space to being a space that has both a private and a public aspect, or at least not necessarily a public always aspect, but where you're allowing more people in, particularly through video chat. And then if you think about, some people have choices on that and some people don't. And you also don't know, when you are in a video chat setting, who else will be involved. So it's a very different scenario for you to think that you have privacy when you're in a video call with one or two friends or with family members. But if you're in a meeting for work, or if you're in class, or think about if you're a model for art classes, and your world is that you're a nude model, and now all of a sudden people are seeing not only you nude, but you're in your home and you don't know who else is watching you, that really changes the choices that you make and how people are, you're interacting with people. Also, the information that has been shared during the pandemic has all, the good reasons are put behind that in order to justify why an employer has to shift from not collecting information about places that their employees have gone or their health status, to now requiring, in a lot of instances, employers to collect that information. but and people have accepted that because of the desire to control the spread of the disease and for safety reasons in the workplace. But that also is a new mindset, which we have to be careful that we're thoughtful about if that mindset will continue going forward. So now you make a change for a good reason, but then that becomes the new norm. And unless you make changes and are thoughtful about it, then it just stays the norm by default. What we learned from 9/11 was that there was an incredible increase in surveillance, which was justified at the time by the threats of additional terrorist attack, but that people didn't really comment on or notice for years until they realized that the NSA was monitoring their own conversations. And that prompted the conversations about if those norms needed to change again. So drawing on lessons from that, I think I would call out, and I have a piece coming up in the symposium issue for the journal about the need to be intentional about it. And also people will say, well, don't companies want to collect all of this information? You know, isn't this just an excuse for them to collect it? Companies sometimes do, but it depends on their industry. So for some companies, they can monetize it, but for others, it's just a burden for them to keep collecting it. And they're doing it because they think that they have to, or that's what the norm is. But just to conclude my opening remarks, I'd like to point out too that we saw particularly in public health instances a century ago, where you would have a tuberculosis outbreak or other types of infectious disease, that during those times, it was very common for marginalized communities to have their privacy rights intruded on more than the general population, and the blame put on them. So as we're thinking about it, it would be good to take a 2020 hindsight perspective to see how intrusive were these norms, and were they more intrusive on marginalized communities or those with less power? Or were they, the better approach would be to figure out how to take a more targeted approach so that if there are intrusions on privacy, that they're effective and that they're narrowly designed for whatever the justification is. In this case, the exigency of the pandemic. So just generally, that's how I've been assessing what we've been going through and thinking about it too. And I look forward to being able to talk about this more with the other panelists, but also hearing about their thoughts on how they've been assessing the pandemic and what they've been noticing.
Yeah, very, very thoughtful and insightful. I'd sensed that this sort of reconceptualization of what is home and where spaces are real and virtual was happening, but to articulate it that way is I think brings a lot together. All right, so Professor Gilreath, you've been thinking more about privacy-related issues in the university setting. So,
yes. To borrow from Admiral Stockdale, why am I here? I think I'm here because my perspective on these issues is much more limited, but the conversation I had with the journal editors was about certain resistance I've had to policies that were designed, I think, primarily for administrative expediency that didn't necessarily fully evaluate or comprehend privacy-based and other sorts of risks that might be entailed in those policies for faculty or students. And much of that dovetails, I think, with this reconceptualization of the home, what it means, and in a sense, to what extent is one master of one's home. And so, for example, many universities have employed mandatory recording policies where classes are concerned, or said to be mandatory. I mean, it's a misapprehension of the employment relationship between faculty and universities to think we can be made to do much we're not persuaded to do. But of course, in many other settings, there is a great deal more coercion possible. And from my perspective, I don't believe that universities have the right to insist that students allow us into their private spaces. In particular, because so many of them are sharing those spaces with people who haven't signed up for these classes, who aren't part of these sort of policy implications. And more than that, I think we live in an age in which bad actors can take 5 or 6 seconds of a discussion and post that online somewhere without context and cause a tremendous amount of difficulty for people, especially I think in my context, people who are about to become lawyers. And I'm not sure it was fully thought through, the extent to which those risks were apparent. And I also think, there are ways that these policies could have been articulated that would have apprehended the risks, that would have ameliorated the risks. But I think the most expedient path was followed, not necessarily the most reflective path. And so I've spent some time thinking about how to structure policies around those concerns that would safeguard students and, of course, myself from being misrepresented in various ways. But that's sort of essentially my perspective on this issue.
Okay, so more focused look at some of the issues that Professor Jacobs raised more globally. So
yes, I think so.
That's so Professor Marsden, you sort of broadening it out, you've looked at disasters of a variety of different types, and you're looking at sort of a more macro scale of how society is coping. So you have a lot to share with us, but give us 10 minutes of a running start on something.
Sure. So one of the things that, following up on Russell and Shannon's comments is, the immense amount of risks and the immense amount of challenges that we've all faced with the pandemic. My article in particular before I get started, many thanks to the Wake Forest Journal of Business and Intellectual Property Law for having this panel and for bringing all of us here today. Risks, there's many risks and many challenges that we faced, as a society and a nation. And one of the things in general, I think that we can take away from the pandemic and one of the tragedies, I think, is that there's just so much division and so much politicization, whether it's, mask mandates or lockdowns, the merits and cons of lockdowns. And so I think a lot of people kind of see, they view what's going on in terms of government versus, private action or private freedom. And so my perspective, I wanted to share just a few minutes from the realm of crop insurance, is we sometimes can see government and individuals as like mutually exclusive interests, or government and private industry as mutually exclusive. But I think one of the things that we can look at in terms of an area I've written on, which is crop insurance, is that government and private entities can work together to mitigate risk. We're coming out of a time when there's so much suffering in this country and world. We have a number of issues with vaccine distribution, which is what I've written on for the journal. We've got a large number, over 500,000 people have lost their lives, and many others who have been afflicted with, perhaps lifelong health problems and emotional scarring. I mean, it's a very difficult time. But one of the things I think looking forward, kind of more optimistically, to bring an optimistic view, is that government and private entities can work together. And I think if we look at disasters on a macro level, crop insurance, the federal crop insurance program was a program that was implemented after the horrors of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression, there's a great amount of suffering. Many farmers lost everything, you know, banks closed. I mean, there were many, many challenges out of the Great Depression. And one of the programs that came out of the Great Depression was the federal crop insurance program. And if you look at the history of crop insurance, you know, at first it was a government-run program, for the most part, run through the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. And the idea of the program was to mitigate risk. So from 1938 to 1980, the federal government was running the program. But in 1980, private insurers were allowed into the federal crop insurance program. And so the way it operates now is that private crop insurers provide insurance for farmers, and those losses then are reinsured by the federal government. So in essence, the federal government serves as a backstop for agriculture risk. And if we look at risk in general, there's, you know, with the increased risk of climate change, there are disasters that can be much more acute for farmers, like a hurricane could wipe out a person's entire crop. And that's why crop insurance is there. It serves as a safety net. Looking today at the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, one of the unfortunate aspects is that so many small businesses suffered so many tremendous financial losses in the past year. And a number of those businesses, of course, have business interruption coverage. But the issue with business interruption coverage is that there are exclusions that will exclude viruses or bacteria. And so it's yet to be seen what happens in the courts on a large scale. But you already have a number of courts that are denying claims for business interruption loss as a result of the pandemic. And so, you know, looking at crop insurance, I think crop insurance can be a model for how to respond to mass disaster. And so, if we look at the pandemic, perhaps, you know, a federal program where private industry can be involved to provide some relief for business owners that have lost so much in the event of a future pandemic. These are all things we can think about as academics and individuals and policymakers to try to mitigate risk for the next big event. Because the sad reality is we probably in our lifetimes, whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster, we'll probably encounter disasters. And this is a time, I think, for all of us to reflect on, you know, what are solutions? What are some solutions at the governmental level? What are private industry solutions so that we can better respond to the next disaster? And if we look at insurance, you know, ways to mitigate risk and mitigate suffering as a result of these terrible disasters. So those are just a few thoughts in general on the pandemic and disaster. So I think it's more optimistic. I mean, even though it's been such a difficult time, this presents an opportunity for everyone to really think and reflect on, you know, how do we best establish policies to respond to the next disaster.
Well, that's just a terrific setup for lots of possible lines of discussion, and I'm trying to decide where to go. But there's a sort of a nice I don't know resonance between the two sets of concerns, and so, as you say, a bit of optimism in the sense that during a disaster type of scenario, you see what oftentimes are sort of warring or competing sectors, government versus private, you know, one regulating, the other trying to avoid regulation, coming together and saying we have a mutual set of problems. And can we make that, you know, bottle that magic and make it work in other non-disaster times versus boundaries that we usually respect, work and home and, you know, body and privacy, you know, being invaded in sort of profoundly, you know, different and potentially upsetting ways, and the threat that becomes sort of the new normal. So some aspects would be good to normalize and make the new normal. Others we want to keep confined. And so that's just sort of my reflecting on the breadth of things we've just heard. But let me try to formulate a sort of a question or a topic for additional discussion. And that is, from my point of view, as a public health law and policy person, I see debate, for instance, in the courts about what authority do governors and legislators have to address things in emergency times. And so emergency declarations, emergency approvals by the FDA, invoking emergency powers to put into place, you know, restraints on civil liberties or to call forth, you know, extraordinary measures, raises several questions. One is, how long does the emergency last? Or do we end up in a sort of, you know, we've ended up in a semi-permanent state of conflict of war powers? Do we end up in a permanent, semi-permanent state of emergency powers? Is number one. And I guess number two is there a more sort of broader concept of disaster emergency that, you know, previously had been sort of domain specific, right? You've got terrorist threat, or you've got an environmental threat to crops, or you've got, you know, in this case, a public health threat, and we sort of thought in these different arenas. So is there a broader sense of disaster emergency that cuts across these domains? And do we need to think more clearly about the boundaries of that concept so it doesn't just, life doesn't become a permanent disaster despite how we may feel about it? So those are two very broad questions, an overarching sense of emergency or disaster, but also a way in which it might be more appropriately confined. So leaves plenty of opportunity to choose a landing spot if you have thoughts about either of those questions. Any of our
great questions, and I'll jump in if people don't mind. I think one of the lessons that we have from this time is that in March and April of 2020, this seemed like an emergency, and we might use that word now, but it's really not, right? So the reaction that we have is incrementally changes, and it definitely doesn't feel normal. But this has become our normal state. And at some point, hopefully later this year, we'll emerge from this. And people sometimes talk about going back to what it was like before, but I don't see that as realistic either, right? Because some things will just persist because that's become a new norm. And other things will recapture from the past. But, you know, as Chad was mentioning, a lot of businesses have gone out too. So for people who have spent most of their time during the pandemic at home, raising their children and teaching their kids classes and working and all of those other things, you know, when they reemerge and they're walking down the main street in their neighborhood and they just realize how all of those small businesses have gone out, you know, that is going to be a big impact on these norms and how we interact with each other, right? So the socialization and the social aspect of that will have to change. The business aspect of that will have to change. Our comfort with technology has changed too, and in ways that are probably both good and both bad, because you use technology without always questioning what you're giving up in exchange, right? So it's made it easy and essential in order for children to keep learning, for business to happen. But in a lot of ways, you do it because that's what's available to you. And so I think when we're looking at how we approach disasters more, not just on this one, but if we want to take a step back and think, okay, what lessons can we learn, and not just apply it to a pandemic? Because if it's not a pandemic that happens next, it might be, as you were alluding to, a terrorist attack, or it might be a natural disaster, right? We've all seen the storms that have been hitting the Gulf Coast over the last couple of years. So it has to be a mindset that is of government and policymakers, as well as of the business community as they're going in, which is a resilience mindset that you're going in, because you will always face that, and you can't be managing through disaster. You have to be always moving towards your policy goals, or whatever the mission is of your corporation, right? What are your business goals that you're moving towards? And so your contingency planning has to be both this specific and broad. So if you're a business, then you need to think, okay, where's my data? So I need to have a backup policy on that, so that if the servers go down, that I'll be able to access it. But you can't just think that that's the only your only risk that you're going to have. And the broader set of scenarios that you go through, the more prepared you will be. Now, thinking about it from an insurance and risk perspective, right, you could go actuarially crazy, because you could go down all of those paths. But we've already seen, my grandmother was born during the Spanish flu. She tells this story of how she was born during the Spanish flu. The doctor came in, my great-grandmother delivered my grandmother, and as soon as my grandmother was out, the doctor said, "I'm guessing she's 6 pounds, I gotta go," because he had to go because everyone in the town was dying from the Spanish flu, right? So that was my grandmother, doesn't have any memories of the Spanish flu, and she was born during it, right? So our memories fade very quickly. People now have done research and resuscitated that research, but 9/11 wasn't that long ago. Hurricane Katrina wasn't that long ago. We've lived through all of these, and you can draw lessons from them. And just even looking at how the courts responded in during Katrina, they were much better prepared to deal with this because they had gone through that. So the courts knew how to operate remotely. They had contingency planning in effect because they had to do it before, which is unfortunate, right? That's what it takes in order to be in that situation. But you can draw from that and learn that you don't have to be on the Gulf Coast in order to draw those lessons. Like if you're in Nebraska or North Dakota, that others have gone through these and have done that contingency planning.
Shannon, I'm just going to jump to you because we live in the same world, so I'm just curious to hear more you're thinking about whether in our little academic microcosm, do you think these changes will become normalized, or are we going to say, oh, that was just an exceptional period and we'll abandon,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think in the academic setting, that's largely up to us. That's largely up to faculty members of universities to decide what they're willing to put up with in terms of administrative constraints that were originally said to be emergency response to the real exigencies of the pandemic. It is true that what we've just seen is probably the largest disruption in the delivery of legal education since World War II. And that, I think, does mean that we ought to approach attempts to deal with those problems with something akin to a benefit of a doubt, right? So, some degree of patience. But I think to sort of reflect on what was just said, there will be, I think, a kind of hastening to get back to normal and to not want to think too terribly much about the hardships that we've just come through. And I think that's exactly the wrong response. I think what needs to be done, I mean, what was evident is that universities didn't have appropriate disaster response policies and procedures. And so hopefully, in the wake of all this, we'll have diversity isn't really possible. And how those responses do affect the most vulnerable populations of students and faculty. Hopefully we'll have some luxury of time before there's another great disruption to the way we do things in universities. What was apparent from what we've been through is that we didn't really have a policy that was meant to address large-scale emergency situations where access to sort of the physical facilities of the university became impossible. And so I hope that in the wake of all this, rather than just sort of rush to get back to as much of normality as we can, we will think carefully about what sort of policy needs to be waiting for the next major disaster. And especially we'll think about it in terms of the policy, the ramifications of that kind of policy on the most vulnerable populations of the university in terms of students and faculty. What special risks are raised there or magnified in those situations, and how can we responsibly deal with them?
So Chad, I posed a couple of very broad questions a few minutes ago. I have a more specific one for you, but let me give you a chance if you've been thinking about the broad things for a moment, and then I'll jump in with my specific.
Absolutely. Like just following on Russell and Shannon's comments, you know, contingency planning is just extraordinarily important. I think that's one of the things that we can all take away from this pandemic. If you look at, you know, I was thinking about, you know, disasters. You know, one of the things with contingency planning, like being here at Florida State and being in a coastal area that is, you know, at a larger risk of hurricane exposure, is the response by policymakers to improve the building codes. And so now you have new construction in the wake of hurricanes, where the construction can, the buildings can withstand like hurricane category 4 and 5 winds. In crop insurance, you know, one of the I guess the long-term risk is of course climate risk, and so you have the program now incentivizing conservation practices. So several years ago, the USDA had regulations that were very rigid on the use of cover crops, for example, and cover crops have been found by researchers to be, the use of cover crops is very resilient for the soil. So I think from a private perspective, like from the insurance perspective, you know, subsidies and incentives can certainly incentivize, you know, really good contingency planning in the event of a disaster. I think from the perspective of the pandemic, you know, one of the things that I think is really essential moving forward, and we're certainly in an era where there is so much partisanship, but with regards to like agriculture and agricultural law, one of the big risks is with pathogens is where will the next pathogen originate? Will it be, you know, will it be from the agricultural setting? And so, you know, greater investment from the government and private industry in tracing programs of livestock and programs to monitor birds for avian influenza. You know, those types of things are incredibly important, you know, particularly in this Congress. I mean, certainly, you know, the pandemic is on everyone's mind, stimulus is on everyone's mind, but long term, you know, being able to identify these pathogens before they cause the next pandemic is incredibly important. And I think that's a big challenge for all of our policymakers, you know, Republican and Democrat, to better fund programs that can identify these risks. So when they do present themselves, that we'll be prepared to handle them as a country and a world. Just in the past month, I think there was an announcement that I guess the CDC and World Health Organization announced that there were reportedly cases of the H5N8 avian influenza that were found in Russia. Now, thankfully, all of the individuals who contracted it were asymptomatic. But what if that would have been a situation where, the individuals had that strain and were very, very sick? I mean, we could be dealing with another pandemic in the next year. So these concerns are very, very real.
Yeah. So you've touched on a couple of, I think, fascinating things. And one is in terms of trying to have the systems and technology in place to catch these things early and respond more effectively. But one real success story, right, in that regard is not necessarily getting ahead of it at the beginning, but catching up at the end, which is with the vaccines, that we had laid in place the technologies that enabled not knowing what the viral agent would be, but just having the technological capacity to quickly do the sequencing and the targeting and what have you, needed to get these very effective vaccines out in massively record time. And that was, as I understand it, large extent due to foresight of certain planners and leaders. And I see you nodding that could be a poster case for not so much disaster avoided, but disaster dealt with, at least at the tail end of things. And then we need to think more about how to. But let me come back to the question I was going to ask. I'm insurance, think about insurance-related issues also, but not in the sort of the broad property casualty arena that you do. But still, one of the concerns in the insurance sector is moral hazard, meaning if you put too many protections in place, it makes people less inclined to anticipate and prepare. And so I'm wondering how you factor that into the combination of the, let's anticipate and prepare versus let's have backstop, let's put the systems in place to prevent the financial disaster, but realize certain institutions are too big to fail, to go back to the financial disaster. But is that as much of a concern in this arena of more natural disasters? That do we have to worry about a type of moral hazard if the government is too well prepared, I guess?
Yeah, so I think in terms of moral hazard, just in general, like one of the case studies one can look at is with flood insurance. And so it's not so much a moral hazard issue with flood insurance, but an adverse selection issue where, like in flood insurance, one of the criticisms of the flood insurance program is that, there's a lot of policyholders that pay into it, but then the same group of claims emerges. And so those are certainly issues, moving forward when we think about pandemic risk that are important to think about. But I think one of the areas of insurance that is really, one of the areas that has really become more popular, and this is a private insurance product, is parametric insurance. And so the way parametric insurance works is if there are certain benchmarks that are met, then the entity will receive a set indemnity. So, like for instance, a city might purchase parametric insurance, but that insurance would only pay out if there was like a Category 4 or 5 hurricane that hit that area within a certain radius. And so parametric insurance has actually become much more popular, particularly for cities and larger municipalities and larger businesses that want to prepare for like the worst case scenario. Like these are worst case scenario type of situations. Very, very rare. So they're high loss, but very rare incidents. And so I think as a private product, you know, parametric insurance is certainly a product that, you know, in the wake of the pandemic, if there was wider availability, could protect against those like worst case, like absolute worst case scenarios where, like if there was a product for businesses that were out of operation for several months, like if they purchased this product, you know, the premiums would likely be low, and so it would be cost effective on a premium scale. But if the event occurs, then obviously there would be a set indemnity. So it wouldn't be, there wouldn't need to be a claims adjusting process. So it would be a lot more efficient for the payout. So one of the things about parametric insurance is once those benchmarks are met, there's an immediate payout. You don't have to have a loss adjusting situation where that may delay the payment of the claim. And then, of course, in insurance, there's, you know, in some terrible, unfortunate cases of bad faith. So I think, you know, certainly there's a role of the government as a backstop, but then I think there's also private products like parametric insurance that may become more popular in the wake of this terrible pandemic.
Okay, yeah. Just necessity is the mother of invention sort of thing. Unprecedented times bring forth new approaches. Well, I think I'm just going to check in with my other two panelists just to see if you have sort of concluding thoughts about any of the topics of the day. We've touched on a lot of issues, but the other points you wanted to convey before we close?
I will just follow on of Chad's comment about the government as a backstop, but then also the role of the private market, because a lot of the norms that are set are norms that the government doesn't influence, right? You know, it might be a response to a government action, but really the norms that will develop in terms of, as I've been talking about privacy, but in terms of disaster response in general, it'll be norms on the business to business or on the business to consumer side. And so the marketplace in a lot of ways will set those norms based on how willing people are to adopt those terms. And of course, there are many aspects that will influence the decisions that come about on that. But now's an important time, I think, for consumers to be very thoughtful and engaged in the process about how those norms get set, because you do have choices, right? And so it's important to balance that, but at the same time, recognize that it's a conversation between all of the stakeholders that are involved in this going forward.
Mm-hmm. And Shannon, any last salvos?
Well, assuming you can hear me, I would say only I think that it would be a mistake to think something of this magnitude can't happen again. And so now is the time to think very carefully about what the best approach to similar situations in the future might be. And I don't think universities have been terribly good at sort of, you know, planning for future exigencies. And this might be a bit of a wake-up call that we ought to be thinking more practically about those kinds of issues.
I'll just share one anecdote because we live in the same space, and I can't remember, you may have been a student, but I don't know how long ago it was, but when we first had talk about the avian flu, and you can edit this out if the students don't I think it's too much of a side, but it just so makes your point. It was at least 10, 12, maybe 15 years ago, where we were told, okay, there's going to be these terrible viruses that are going to sweep the planet, and we got to be prepared. And every institution has to have a contingency plan in place. And ours was to issue all faculty a little small digital tape recorder, so that we could. This was before high-speed internet, so that we could lecture, talk into our microphones, and podcast our lectures. That was our plan. And then, now, you know, when, you know, everything happened, it's like, well, that's the only plan we had. So were you around then, Shannon? I forget.
Yes, I was teaching here then. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know you were on the fact, but there's just
Oh.
the standard issue digital microphones. Anyway, so
Yeah, I still have mine
yeah,
actually.
exactly. I got mine out the other month, and the batteries had corroded because it's been so long. So
I haven't checked.
it just that's the only plan we had. Anyway, all right. Well, on that note, I'll just check in and Chad, do you want to make any finishing remarks?
Yeah, I think just in general, you know, one of the main lessons is you know, as Shannon said, this very well could happen again. So, you know, foresight, contingency planning, and just preparedness are all key things, whether it's a policy realm or individuals to just, you know, constantly, you know, be monitoring situations because things may evolve very, very quickly in the future. We hope that with a lot better planning, disasters, you know, can be avoided. But if disasters do hit, you know, proper planning and proper thinking can certainly eliminate a lot of suffering.
All right. Well, it's again, thanks to the students for finding this terrific panel and allowing me to just show up and wing it, as I obviously have, and just because there's so much knowledge and insight gathered in this small but, you know, virtual space, some in our homes, some in our offices. But in any event, wherever we're coming from, it was a great coming together, and I look forward to seeing the full product online and in print. So thank you all for your time and thoughtful engagement.